So, good afternoon or good day, and welcome to the American Shipper series of the Global Trade Tech Summit. This is the Fireside Chat with myself, Steve Ferreria. I'm CEO of Ocean Audit in Hartford, Connecticut. And today I have a very, very special guest. Matter of fact, this guest is very much in demand. And my good friend is on the other side of the fence here in California, Dan Gardner from Trade Facilitator. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And to give the audience a little flavor for Dan, Dan runs and is CEO and president of Trade Facilitator, a supply chain consulting firm in California. Dan's clients are nationwide, as are mine. But one thing that Dan has in his pedigree, unlike myself, is Dan has been a professor or is an adjunct professor at. Fill us in, Dan, a little bit on where you've taught. And before you do that, though, I do want to tell the audience one thing that Dan probably won't tell. I found out, Dan, that you were voted Professor of the Year at FIU.
That's correct. You're going back a few years now, my friend.
Well, hey, listen, I got a lot more coming up in this fireside chat, so you better be ready.
Yeah, that was, I want to say, tragically, the same semester as 9/11. To be honest with you, so that conjures up obviously some not so pleasant memories, but was fortunate enough to gain that distinction. But to answer your previous question, I have been an adjunct professor my whole career, essentially everywhere I've lived. In Mexico when I lived there, in Colombia when I lived there, but currently Georgia Tech, Cal State Long Beach, and just wrapped up a 6-week certificate program online with Long Beach City College for international transportation and customs procedures. So that's a big part of what I like to do out in the business world.
Congratulations. I mean, I think that I always view your presentations and speeches to companies and private groups around the United States and around the world as leading edge and cutting edge. So I think it's great that the American Shipper has chosen you to be on this fireside chat. As far as where I'm concerned, I'm not sure why they chose me, but I think that having you in the audience today, or participating for our global audience to see is amazing, especially in light of all the things. Sorry?
Yeah, I'm flattered to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's my honor to have you here and to chat. We've known each other for a number of years, and we've worked together, and we're pretty cozy in terms of, I think, each of our strengths, and I think that's one of the nice things about conversations that just flow kind of naturally, like today's being. And I started to think a little bit. I want to pivot a little bit about our conversation on kind of COVID and tariffs and China. And Dan, I just ran some stats over the weekend that I found astonishing. I think you will too. Now, again, the naysayers will say, "Well, Steve, you didn't take this in consideration or that, or you ran the wrong time frame." But one of the things that I think is really important for the audience to know about is I like to look at the velocity of shipments moving. And to me, when I look at less than container load from China, if I look at full container loads, I'm still looking at the individual invoices that move on each of those particular cargo segments. So one invoice might have 4 containers, or it might have just 10 cubic meters, a small shipment. But to me, it's the velocity of how these invoices move. And what I wanted to report to you today and get your comment on right off the bat, because I think this is going to be a real surprise for the audience, is that from January to August of last year, 39 million invoices from China moved. This year, January through August, the same period, 42 million invoices moved. Now, one of the things that's really remarkable, Dan, about that I'd like to get your comment on, is not only have they moved, but they've moved at very much, as you said, higher rates, higher spot rates, and the ocean environment is just crunching it right now. So there's profits being made, out the wazoo. The steamship lines are fat and happy. Cargo's coming in, but yet we have unemployment, we have retailer turmoil, we have new vocabulary with non-essential retailers, and we also have Dan Gardner's 10 points of what to do in a COVID environment. So, question to reframe this all: why the improvement in volume right now? Who's paying for these so-called tariffs at the point that obviously the companies are able to handle these tariffs because the volumes are coming in like gangbusters? And how is it impacting the overall retail environment?
Yeah, I think it's a two-part story. Um, Needless to say, we learned the hard way about the PPE supply chain. So I think there's a lot of that in there, even though PPE is sourced in places in Asia other than China as well. So I think there's a big part of that. But the other part is, I think that we living in a consumption society that retailers, traditional retailers, e-tailers, et cetera, are placing some pretty big bets on what people are going to buy back to school, if we want to call it that anymore, at least not in a traditional sense. But of course, gearing up for the holidays, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas time, et cetera. I just think, and it's an opinion, that retailers are placing some, companies in general are placing some pretty big bets in terms of what's going to be bought and paid for and consumed towards the end of the year. How that pans out, we will have to wait and see.
That's interesting, Dan. I know that you had put together a great treatise on the top 10 things back in March as the pandemic was starting to rear its ugly head here in the United States. 10 ways to prepare for global trade disruption was actually the name of the article that you had written. And it was just really a kind of a semi crystal ball for what supply chain participants would be seeing and going through as we navigate through the crisis. So I think your 10-point plan that you developed on navigating through COVID was right on. And I think that one of the things that we're starting to see, in the first 60 days of COVID, right, we saw the number one development or the need was to keep the supply chain organizations preserving cash and managing working capital. And then I think as we started to get a little bit beyond that, maybe a little bit past your March philosophy, we're starting to see companies focusing more towards managing supplier risk and workplace planning. So I think that if you look at where you were coming from COVID and supply chain and volumes coming in March, and in light of the fact that now companies are having to kind of really band-aid this and bring it down to a micro focus on managing suppliers and POs almost on an intimate one-by-one basis. How would you give the audience some tips in terms of how would you fill in what you wrote in March versus what they're dealing with now? And how might you project 3 or 4 months out in terms of where the volatility of the supply chain might be heading, and what could clients do to mitigate that?
Yeah, well, number one, I wish I never had to write that paper because one would think that, especially 4 or 5, whatever it is, 6 months later, that would be talking in a little more sanguine terms, a little more hopeful, a little more optimistic. But I think we're going to be in this for a bit. One of the big things that surprised me, I think it was fairly obvious that ocean rates were going to go up to the extent that the carriers could manage supply and finally pull together in the face of an existential threat to their own financial viability and stand their ground on rates. That they've gone well beyond that in terms of their ability to control supply, meaning blanking sailings and such, and getting to the point now where the rates are, you could use the word abusive, I think, especially given the circumstances. So as far as what I would recommend to people is plan for the long term. I wouldn't. Geez, it's hard to say, but hard to predict the future. But plan for the long term. Plan for rates to be high through November. Don't negotiate any rates until a little further into next year. I mean, typically, this ocean freight contracts start to talk in March, April timeframe. You might want to wait a little bit longer, see how things pan out for next year. Now that gets hard to do because you run the risk of, if you wait too long, then there won't be any space available on ships or through NVOCCs. But I'd wait a little bit longer, take a non-traditional approach to contract management and contract negotiation going into next year, because I think this big boom is going to be followed by a pretty substantial dip.
Speaking of those dips, right now we're dealing with something that I don't think we as supply chain professionals, ocean professionals, logistics pros have ever seen before. And that's really the kind of the intersection of COVID, right? With not only, um, you know, unrational markets, but also tariff issues, right? So now this whole thing kind of pivots back to, where China tariffs are, right? And you have Biden come out recently that says that, he originally made a soundbite kind of miscue that said he's going to do away with the Trump tariffs. And then his spokesman came out and said, on day one of his administration, he would monitor that situation quite carefully. So I guess, Dan, how would you reframe, you're a CFO, you're a logistics professional, you're a supply chain professional, and I see this every day in my practice, right? There's a conversation taking place between a finance side of things and logistics side of things. So when finance says to logistics, why are these cost overruns happening? I want you to control these carriers. And then what the CFO has maybe forgotten about is that, a lot of these cost overruns are built into the fact that they've been silently absorbing the tariffs all these times. And so I guess from an intersection of where you see and you consult with clients, how are clients taking the tariffs? How are they dealing with the intersection of tariffs and COVID and increased supply chain cost? And what tips could you give the audience for enhancing or reducing those? Because those inevitable conversations between finance and logistics are taking place every day. Logistics is getting beat up horribly because maybe the C-suite doesn't fully comprehend about some of these changes. Comments and thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that companies, the importers, and their overall business are watching their gross margins and their net margins erode. You start with the section 301 tariffs, more commonly known as the Trump tariffs. Popular to beliefs in some circles, the Chinese don't pay for the tariffs; the importer does. Might Chinese vendors suffer because U.S. importers look to buy goods in other countries? That's 100% true. But equally true is the fact that the importer pays the tariffs. That's just unequivocal and disingenuous for anyone to say otherwise. So you had margins being depleted because landed costs are going up. Now you add to that the increase in ocean freight, over double than what it was a year ago. You just can't escape the math that companies that were enjoying some pretty substantial gross margins have watched those margins erode. And of course, the irony and the tragedy of part of COVID, and if you want to look at it from a cynical sense, companies were compelled and justifiably compelled to furlough people, which takes away from the payroll expense. So that payroll expense, the reduction thereof, is somewhat compensating for the loss in margin due to increased ocean freight expense and the Trump tariffs. And that is an unintended consequence of pretty epic proportions because, in the end, for an economy, who wants to save money by creating unemployment? That just doesn't make any sense.
And you hit the nail on the head. I definitely want to spend a part of our time in the next couple minutes after we get through a few topics on that whole issue of being furloughed. I mean, I live it and see it every day. And I mean, I see clients that have a department of 10 down to 2, and they're doing a heck of a job. And their leadership says, well, why do we need the other 8 to begin with? And I totally get where this is a real slippery slope. And I want to come back and address it because I think was part of our rebuilding for Americana in small business and import export. And I've talked about it ad nauseum in our private talks. We really need to develop the interior point factories in Ohio and in the cornfields in Nebraska, and we need to get people back to work. And there may be a strategy that we can talk about in a few minutes. But before we do that, though, I want to kind of segue back to a talk that we had a few months back, right around before COVID happened, and the movement away from China into other countries. And I think one of the things that I've seen, you look at a survey like Gardner. Gardner did a group survey, and they said a third of companies plan to move either entirely or out of China by 2023. And then the American Chamber in China, American Chamber of Commerce, said that no, not at all. 84% of our members say no movement at all, and another 72% say no, even with COVID, we're going to stick with China. So there's a really, really, really mixed message in terms of where people are moving away. And if you talk about the numbers I talked about a few minutes ago in terms of the velocity of shipments, nothing seems to have changed. China seems to have grown and grown, and this steamroller keeps going. So put it in context for us, Dan. How are moves away from China feasible? And why aren't we seeing it in these numbers? Because, quite frankly, Vietnam can only handle so much growth. So, where are these people moving to? And when will we start to see it reflected in the volumes?
Yeah, I think there's some assumptions built into the whole leave China theory, and we can unwrap that fairly quickly. Number one, sourcing, overseas sourcing is different from purchasing. Purchasing is just that, placing purchase orders on vendors. But to get to that point, you have to vet these vendors over a period of 2 to 3 years in terms of production capacity, the type of products that a given vendor makes, be they in China or anywhere for that matter. R&D considerations. Are we providing molds? What's the unit cost? What's the landed cost? The list goes on and on and on. So I will say that I'm a little bit surprised that people haven't left China sooner, because the Section 301 tariffs have been around for a couple of years now. But the question becomes, and this addresses your Vietnam comment, where are you going to go? Because China has a 40-year head start in terms of production capacity and diversity of products that they make. I've seen a number of companies make assumptions. We do a lot of work in Latin America. I lived in Mexico for 4 years and still do a fair amount of work down there. Companies that just say, we want to leave China and go to Mexico. Well, that's a good strategy. But does the product or products you're looking for, are they even made in Mexico? If they are, where do the raw materials come from? Because they're likely coming from China, depending on what they are. What's the production capacity? What's the quality? What's the unit cost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And albeit anecdotal, what I've seen repeatedly, so when you see something repeatedly, it goes from anecdotal to being a pattern of outcomes, is that depending on the industry, let's use Mexico as an example. Well, let's go back to Vietnam. They're just inundated. Let's start with that, because they were choice number one, and they don't have the diversity of products that a China has. Moving on to Mexico, I've spoken with potential vendors in Mexico on behalf of our clients, and I've had several of them literally chuckle into the phone and say, "Do you really think you're the first person calling me about this?" Everybody and their brother is trying to move into Mexico, and Mexico, while a good, strong market, does not have the production capacity or the diversity of industries that a China has. Nobody does, and I think that's a big part of the situation. People are willing to go, but where are you going to go to becomes the
Well,
question.
I saw today. It's exciting news that you talked about Mexico. I'm so glad that the way we flow this conversation makes so much sense. We've got about a couple minutes left in our show today, and I think one of the things in a quick 30-second hit here is I noticed that Foxconn today announced that they're looking into Mexico and exploring any kind of financial incentives. But when they talk about that, Dan, are they just basically talking about the provisions within the July 1 USMCA, or are there potential other financial incentives that companies might get going to Mexico? 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. So USMCA, obviously, you have to meet regional value content requirements. You can bring in raw materials from outside of the free trade area, but it has to meet specific products have to meet regional value content thresholds. In addition to that, the zero duty benefit, it is very likely that the Mexican government would offer other types of incentives, be they tax related, hiring related, et cetera. So yeah, the answer is it's both.
And we talked about helping our friends that were displaced. And you made a great topical point about people that were furloughed. I like the idea too, Dan, and it's something we could develop for the audience now, and maybe through additional American Shipper publication or media overview. But the whole idea of fractional leadership, where out of place, very senior logistics people can go ahead and manage the logistics departments for 8, 10, 12 small vendors around the country on a fractional basis. I think this is not looked at strong enough, and I love your comments in 15 seconds about fractional leadership in logistics.
I think it's a great concept, and I'll be honest with you, I hadn't really not known that much about it until you brought it up last week when we were preparing and such. So I think that there's a lot of intellectual capital out there that can be put to good work to the benefit of the entire country. So 100% support that idea. Should be explored.
Great. I think we should definitely make that another caveat as we continue our series of discussions. We've been talking in a fireside chat with Steve Ferreria, CEO. That's me. Ocean Audit with Dan Gardner, President of Trade Facilitators. That's him. And I want to thank the American Shipper for having us in this great tech summit. And I wish all our supply chain participants and logistics participants a great show. And Dan and I will always be available to address any questions or comments you have, and we'll gladly go and expand any of these topics. So for now, Dan, thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
And American Shipper, thank you for having us. It's been an honor. And to all the people out there, continue good luck, stay safe in COVID, and we wish you great prosperity. This is Steve Ferreira signing off and Dan Gardner signing off for now. Thanks, guys.